Well, hello there, and again, welcome to another session here on the web. Good to have all of you with us once more. You know, over the years, I've been rather confused, and I think some of you have too, to a certain extent, about this idea about how God leads us. How does God lead us? I mean, people say, well, the Lord spoke to me, that He put it on my heart. He laid it on my heart that I was compelled to do this by God. And I think to myself, what does that mean, led by God in that way? How are we to interpret that? I mean, there's a lot of people who think they hear God speaking to them that unfortunately were led to do a lot of very horrible things. I think of the son of Sam. I think of Ted Bundy. I think of Jeffrey Dahmer and this guy Casey, who did some very horrible things and all claimed that they heard voices telling them to do this, that, or the other thing. How do you know? How do you know it's God speaking to you when you say, well, God told me to do this? Why not perhaps it's your ego, or maybe it's your vanity driving you to do a particular task for a certain reason, and God has nothing to do with it at all. So the question is, how do we know? How do we know God is indeed leading us? I remember years ago, and I'm sure some of you do too, when old Oral Roberts, bless his heart, he passed away some years ago, but he mentioned that he needed to raise $1 million because God told him to raise $1 million. And if not, well, he was going to be taken back home, to heaven in his mind, which was home. And I've often thought, well, maybe he didn't want to meet that goal because heaven, of course, is traditionally anyway, the goal of all Christians, to get to heaven, die and go to heaven. But the point of it is, and I come back to this question, how do we know that God is indeed talking to us when we just claim to be doing certain things because we think God has told us to do this? Well, over here in the book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 14, there's a statement here made by the Apostle Paul in writing this narrative to the Christians in Rome that begins to put a little light on this. And what I'd like to do is spend the remaining portion of my time clarifying this question of how we know God is leading us when He is indeed leading us. Here in chapter 8 and in verse 14 we read, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." Now this is an interesting Greek word I want to bring to your attention, translated in the English as led, but does indeed begin to give us some idea of being actually led by God. Now admittedly, it's not as clear as we would like it to be, but the fact of it is, at least we know that if we're led by God, we are confirmed and validated to be sons of God. But how can we really understand a little bit deeper and richer meaning of what this word, this Greek word, ago, by the way, ago, is all about? Well, let me use some illustrations. Perhaps some of these illustrations will help us to better understand just what this Greek word ago means. Over here in Luke chapter 4, let me bring your attention there, where Jesus Himself is confronted with a situation where a lot of people are surrounding Him and they've come to Him for a particular service. They recognized that He, Jesus, was indeed blessed and gifted in a particular way to do certain things for them. And notice what we read here in this section. We read in verse 40, Luke chapter 4, "Now, when the sun was setting, all they that had any sick with different diseases brought them unto Him. And He laid His hands on every one of them and healed them. And devils also came out of many, crying out and saying, You are the Christ, the Son of God." So here we see a bunch of people coming to Jesus. They all have needs. They have certain expectations, if you know what I'm saying. And whether or not they actually had a real strong belief in understanding whether or not Christ could indeed heal them, the fact of it is, two things occurred here that are certainly obvious, I think, to all of us. They trusted those that were taking them to Jesus enough and believed enough to go and follow the lead of their friends or their relatives or whoever was taking them to Jesus, and indeed went in His audience, hopefully to get healed. And again, admittedly, maybe some of them didn't all believe in it, but they believed their friends enough to be able to follow that lead. They trusted and they believed. Notice over here, a similar situation, but dealing with two different individuals. Andrew, of all things, the brother of soon-to-be disciple and later on apostle, Peter, of Jesus Christ. And here in verse 40 of John, chapter 1, we read this scenario that is mentioned here on behalf of John's report. He says here, one of the two which heard John spoke and followed him, and it was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said unto him, We have found the Messiah, which is being interpreted the anointed, the Christ. And he brought Peter, that is Andrew did, him to Jesus. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. And so here Jesus basically recognizing Peter, but Peter being now in the audience of Jesus as a result of following his brother Andrew. And what did Peter do in order to follow Andrew? Well, he submitted to Andrew, didn't he? He sure did. And he obeyed Andrew's lead. He took Andrew's lead and obeyed it. Here we see that the others in Luke there, they trusted and they believed. And here, Peter submitted and obeyed. And admittedly, this particular situation here resulted in them being exposed to Jesus Christ, who now got to know them. And I want to bring this to your attention because when you follow God's lead, there's a sidebar benefit to this that many of us, I don't believe, really recognize the value of. And it's very important, I think, that we do take a moment and pause and realize that when we come into the presence of a relationship with Jesus Christ and God the Father, that we don't only begin to learn to know God, but God begins to know us. Notice here in Galatians and in chapter 4 and in verse 6, we read this, Because you are the sons of God, has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. You've got an intimate relationship. That's what that word Abba means. Wherefore you are no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God. You are an heir, a co-heir, we're told in Romans chapter 8. He says you're an heir of God through Christ. Howbeit then, when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. In other words, when you were unconverted and you were serving Diana and all these pagan gods, you obeyed, didn't you? Of course you did. And in so doing, you began to know that particular theology of God. But here, the apostle goes on here, Paul does, and he says in verse 9, But now, after you have known God, and he reloads here and says, or are rather known of God. And he's about ready to correct them because they were backsliding. But my point here is, Paul making it very clear in the course of this discussion, that they not only knew God, and that's why he was having a hard time understanding that they were backsliding into their own ways, but then he makes it even clearer, a clearer point in this relationship of just not knowing God, but that God knows us. And in 1 Peter chapter 4 there, it's explained to all of us in Peter there, chapter 4, whereby how God gets to know us. And He gets to know us through our trials, the way we react to certain things, the way we do things, how we essentially behave when confronted with certain circumstances, conditions, situations. And He then begins to see our temperament, our demeanor, how we handle stress, how we handle success, how we handle and perhaps deal with failure in our lives. And these things bring to His mind and to His attention just how we are. And in due course, my friends, due course, we begin to understand that this love toward God begins to develop because we see reciprocation throughout the course of our life, and that translates into evidence in our own minds to let us know that God is indeed actively intervening, actively integrating with our lives, circumstances, and situations. But it's important, but it's very, very important that we continue to trust and believe in this Word. And then as we get to know this Word, and that only comes through taking some time and studying it, granted, but as we come to become more familiar with this Word, as we trust and believe in it, we submit and obey it. That's right, my friends. The love of God. Notice this, the love of God over here. Let me turn your attention to 1 John, back here toward the end of the Bible, over toward Revelation there. 1 John, and in chapter 5, notice a biblical definition of what the love of God is. Notice this. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, for this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous. Oh yes, my friends, it is important for us to recognize that there are certain laws, guidelines, standards, boundaries that all of us need to abide by, that in due respect to God and the expression of this love that we should have for Him does mandate, demand. It requires us to obey. Notice over here in John, Gospel of John now, chapter 14, and over here in verse 15, we read this, if you love me, keep my commandments. Drop down to verse 21, notice this, he that has my commandments and keeps them, he it is that loves me, and he that loves me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and will manifest myself to him. My friends, it's so important that we get this in our minds and we understand this concept. To be assured, to recognize, to be validated in our own minds that we are indeed being led by God, we need to believe and trust. Trust and believe. And then when you trust and believe, you need to submit your will to God's will. And what I mean by that is then through to and by the obedience to His law via the example of what Jesus expressed and showed and exemplified to all of us in His own lifestyle, in His own demeanor. And of course, without a doubt, the only way we can achieve and really accomplish that is with God's Spirit in us, working, driving, compelling us to study and to better understand with clarity the expectations that God has on all of us. Won't you let us help you to better understand just exactly how God can indeed lead you, and you, most importantly, be assured He is? Hit us on our website at www.cgi.org. We've got a free offer there. It's titled, Piece of Literature Easily Read in One Sitting, How to Be Used of God. That's right, how to be used of God. This is very important information. You can also email us at info@cgi.org. Both of those contact points will enable you to access this free offer that we have for you on this YouTube and or web presentation, How to Be Used of God. My friends, you need to get this. Let us help you. Get that piece of literature, study it, and help it to help you to better clarify in your own mind how you know you are indeed being led by God. And we'll see you right back here at another time, back on the web.